Nobody in Coldwater Bluff could explain exactly when Elias Westbrook stopped coming down from the mountain. Some said it was after the fire. Others said it was before that, after the trial, after the verdict that split the town in half and left him standing alone on the wrong side of a very long silence. What everyone agreed on, without much argument, was that he was better left alone. That going up that ridge looking for him was the kind of thing a person did once and never repeated. So when the stagecoach rolled into town on a gray Tuesday morning in October, and a young woman stepped off it with a single traveling trunk and a folded letter in her gloved hand, the people of Coldwater Bluff did what small towns always do. They watched, they whispered, and they waited for someone else to say something first. Her name was Evelyn Harrell, yet she was 26 years old, unhurried in her movements, and possessed of the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable, not because it was cold, but because it seemed entirely deliberate. She looked around the main street with steady eyes, asked the stagecoach driver where she might find the sheriff's office, thanked him without waiting for his reaction, and walked in that direction with her trunk rolling behind her. The letter in her hand was addressed to Elias Westbrook. She had written it herself 4 months prior, in response to a small notice tucked into the back pages of a St. Louis Gazette. The notice had been brief, almost blunt. Rancher, 40 acres. No debts. Seeks capable woman for honest marriage. Coldwater Bluff, Colorado Territory. No name, no further description. Further said most women who saw it moved past it without a second thought. Evelyn had read it 3 times. Sheriff Dale Cobb was a careful man. He had held the office of Coldwater Bluff for 11 years and had developed over that time a reliable instinct for trouble that had not yet let him down. When Evelyn Harrell walked through his door and set that letter on his desk, his instinct fired immediately. He picked it up, read it, set it back down. "You wrote to Elias Westbrook," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did," Evelyn said, and he wrote back, twice. Cobb leaned back in his chair and studied her the way a man studies weather he doesn't trust. She was not what he expected. She was not nervous, not chattering, not performing the cheerful hopefulness he had seen in the 2 other women who had passed through town over the years, with similar intentions, and left within a week, both of them pale and shaken and unwilling to say exactly why. "Miss Harrell," he said carefully, "I don't know what he told you in those letters." "He told me about the ranch," she said. "The acreage, the condition of the house, the elevation, the winters." She paused. "He was thorough." "He's a thorough man," Cobb agreed. "That's not the part I'm worried about." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. "Then say the part you're worried about, Sheriff. I've come a long way, and I'd rather hear it plainly." Cobb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed a loose shutter against the side of the building. He glanced at the window, then back at her. "Elias Westbrook has not set foot in this town in 3 years, he said. "He does not attend church. He does not come to market. He sends a boy named Percy down the mountain once a month with a list, and Percy brings back what he needs, and that is the entirety of his contact with this community." He paused. "There are people in this town who will tell you he is dangerous. I will not tell you that because I don't believe it is accurate. But I will tell you that he is not an easy man, and that the mountain he lives on has a way of making people feel very small and very far from anything familiar." Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. "Is there a room at the boarding house?" she asked. She stayed 3 days in town before she sent word up the mountain. She did not spend those days idle. But she visited the general store and introduced herself to the owner, a broad-shouldered woman named Ida Phaneuf, who had the eyes of someone who had seen everything twice and found most of it disappointing. She ate her meals at the small dining room beside the boarding house, where a retired cattle hand named George Lawson held court at the corner table every evening and told stories that were mostly true. She walked the length of the main street in the mornings, quietly mapping the town, learning its rhythms. People were polite to her, carefully polite, in the way people are when they are reserving judgment. She could feel the questions beneath the surface of every conversation. Why him, of all men? Why would you come here for him? But no one asked them directly, and she did not offer answers she hadn't been asked for. On the second evening, Ida Phaneuf set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked and sat down across the counter. "You seem sensible," Ida said, in a tone that suggested this made the situation more confusing, not less. "I try to be," Evelyn said. "Then I'll ask you something sensible." Ida wrapped both hands around her own cup. "What exactly do you know about what happened to that man?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I know what he told me." "And what did he tell you?" There was a pause. The lantern above them flickered once in a draft from the door. "Enough," Evelyn said quietly, "that I still came." Ida studied her for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and said nothing more. But something in her expression shifted. Not quite approval, not quite worry. Something in between. It like a woman watching a person walk a trail she herself had never been brave enough to take. The message came back from the mountain on the morning of the fourth day. Percy, the errand boy, 13 years old, gap-toothed, and deeply serious about his work, appeared at the boarding house door just after breakfast with a folded note. He handed it to Evelyn, waited while she read it, and then said, in a rehearsed way that suggested he had been told exactly what to say, "He says to come tomorrow, before noon, and to bring only what you can carry yourself." Evelyn refolded the note and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. Percy nodded, turned, and left at a near run, as if he had somewhere important to be. Evelyn stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking up at the ridge that rose behind the town, dark with pine, half hidden in low cloud, enormous in the way that things are when you haven't yet learned their edges. She had crossed 4 states to get here. She had left behind a life that no longer fit her, a city that had grown too loud, and a grief she had carried so long it had started to feel like furniture, always in the way, impossible to move. She had read a 3-line notice in the back of a gazette and felt, for reasons she could not entirely explain, that it had been written for her specifically. She did not know yet what she would find when she reached the top of that ridge. She did not know what Elias Westbrook looked like, or how he carried himself, or whether the quiet in his letters was peace or something darker wearing the same face. Yet what she knew was that she had said she would come, and Evelyn Harrell had never yet said a thing she didn't mean. The mountain waited, and somewhere above the tree line, in a house that had not heard a woman's voice in longer than he cared to count, Elias Westbrook read Percy's return message, 2 words, nothing more, and sat with it in his hands for a very long time before he folded it carefully and set it on the table beside his coffee. She was coming. Whether that was the beginning of something or the end of the only piece he had left, he genuinely did not know. The trail up to Elias Westbrook's property was not marked. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed when Percy led her to the edge of town the next morning and pointed vaguely toward the tree line with the confidence of someone who had made the trip enough times that the path had become obvious to him and invisible to everyone else. He had offered to walk with her to the first switchback, and she had thanked him and accepted, because she was practical enough to know when she needed a guide, and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. The second thing she noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound. Birds moved through the upper branches. Wind shifted the pine needles. A creek ran somewhere below the trail to her left. But beneath all of that was something else. A stillness that felt intentional, as though the mountain itself had decided long ago that it was not interested in being disturbed. Percy left her at a flat boulder beside a split pine tree with a piece of faded red cloth tied to one branch. "That's the marker," he said. "Stay on the left side of the creek from here. You'll see the fence before you see the house." He hesitated, then added, in the tone of someone delivering information he'd been told not to editorialize on, "He knows you're coming. He'll be outside." Then he turned and went back down the hill, and Evelyn was alone. She walked for 40 minutes before she saw the fence. It was well built, not ornamental, not aggressive, just solid and carefully maintained. The kind of fence a man puts up when he means to keep his boundaries clear without making a statement about it. Beyond it, through a break in the trees, she could see the roof of the house. Low, wide. It built into the hillside rather than on top of it, as if whoever designed it had wanted it to belong to the landscape rather than interrupt it. And then she saw him. He was standing at the fence line with his back half turned to her, doing something with a post that had worked loose from the ground. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had pictured, though she wasn't sure why she had pictured anything at all. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He wore no jacket despite the cold, just a heavy flannel shirt, with the sleeves pushed to the elbow, and he worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent years doing physical things alone and had stopped wasting motion somewhere along the way. He heard her footsteps when she was still 20 feet away. He didn't startle. He simply straightened, but set down the tool he was holding and turned to face her. His eyes were gray, not unkind, but careful. The way eyes get when a person has learned to read a room before committing to anything in it. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "Evelyn Harrell," she said, because someone had to say something first. "I know," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, and unhurried. "Elias Westbrook." "I know," she said. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of something. Not quite a smile, but its first cousin. Then it was gone. "You found the marker," he said. "Percy is a good guide." "He is." Elias reached down and picked up his tool, turned it once in his hand, and set it on the fence post. "Come inside. Coffee's on." The house was clean. That was not what she had expected, though she had tried not to expect anything. The floors were swept. The dishes were stacked. A wood stove in the corner put out a steady, even heat, and a row of books on a low shelf beside the window were arranged with the kind of careful order that suggested they were actually read and returned to their places, not just displayed. There were 2 chairs at the table. He had set 2 cups out already. She noticed that. She didn't mention it. He poured the coffee and sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the table with the particular honesty of 2 people who have already said enough in letters that pretending to be strangers would be slightly absurd. "The house is bigger than you described," she said. "I described it accurately," he said. "You said modest. It is modest. It has 4 rooms. For 1 person," he said. 4 rooms is modest." She wrapped her hands around the cup. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the light came through the window in long, pale strips across the floor. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. "You should know," he said. after a moment, "that I am not easy company." "You mentioned that," she said, "in the second letter. I meant it. I understood that you meant it." He looked at her steadily. "Most people find this place isolating." "I'm not most people," she said. Not defiantly, just as a simple statement of fact. He was quiet again. He turned his cup slowly on the table once, and she noticed that his left hand carried a scar that ran from the base of his thumb across the back of his wrist and disappeared beneath his sleeve. She did not ask about it. Not yet. "Why me?" he said. That it was not quite a question, and not quite an accusation. It was the thing he had clearly been carrying since her first letter arrived, and had not yet found a way to put down. Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Because you were honest," she said finally. "The notice you placed didn't promise anything. It didn't dress itself up. It said what it was and left the decision to whoever was reading." She paused. "That told me more about you than most men tell me in a year of conversation." He said nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. Not much, just enough for a careful person to notice. "I'm not here to fix you," she added quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I think you need saving, or because I find damaged things romantic. I'm here because I needed a life that was honest, and yours seemed like it might be." The wind shifted outside. A log settled in the stove. Elias Westbrook looked at the woman sitting across his table. This stranger who had crossed 4 states, walked an unmarked trail up a mountain that most people avoided, and was now sitting in his kitchen, telling him the truth, with the same ease other people used to talk about the weather. He didn't know what to do with that. He had forgotten, somewhere in the last 3 years, how to be in the same room as someone who wasn't afraid of him. She stayed for lunch. It was not planned. He had not prepared for it. But noon came and she hadn't left, and neither of them had suggested she should. And at some point, he stood up and started cutting bread, and she stood up and found the pot without being told where it was. And they moved around the small kitchen with a carefulness that was not quite comfort yet, but was something adjacent to it. Over the meal, they spoke practically. About the acreage, about the condition of the south pasture, about the well and the root cellar, and the fact that the second bedroom window had a frame that swelled in wet weather and needed replacing before winter set in properly. She asked questions that surprised him, specific, informed questions about soil drainage and livestock, and how long the mountain stayed passable once the first snow fell. He answered them. She listened in the way people listen when they are actually storing information rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. It was, and he thought, the most words he had said aloud in longer than he could accurately remember. When she rose to leave, the afternoon had already started to lean toward evening. She put on her coat and picked up the bag she'd carried up from town, and he walked her to the gate in the fence, the way a person does when they are observing a formality they haven't yet decided whether to abandon. At the gate, she stopped and turned to him. "I'd like to come back tomorrow," she said, "if that's agreeable." He looked at her. The light was going gold through the trees behind her, and the cold was sharpening the way it does in the mountains just before dark. And she was standing there, asking him a plain question with plain eyes, and he found, without entirely meaning to, that he wanted her to come back. "It's agreeable," he said. She nodded, turned to go. Evelyn." She stopped. He wasn't sure, for a moment, why he had said her name. He hadn't planned to. There was something he wanted to say, some acknowledgement of the strangeness and the unexpectedness of the day, of the fact that she had come all this way and had not been what he braced for, of the fact that the house had felt different with another person in it, and he was not sure yet whether that frightened him or not. He couldn't find the words for any of that, so he said the only thing that came clearly. "Watch the creek crossing on the way down," he said. "The stones are loose after rain." She looked at him for just a moment longer than was necessary. "Thank you," she said. And then she walked down the mountain, and he stood at the fence until the trees took her, and the sound of her footsteps faded, and the silence came back. Yet it felt different than it had that morning. He couldn't decide yet if that was good. That night in the boarding house, Evelyn sat at the small desk in her room and wrote a single line in the journal she kept, not for anyone else, just for herself, the way some people keep accounts of money, and she kept accounts of truth. He is not what they said, but he is not simple either. There is something buried in him that has not yet decided whether it wants to be found. She closed the journal, blew out the lamp. Outside, the mountain sat dark against the stars, enormous and quiet, and full of whatever it was holding. She would go back tomorrow, and the day after that. And she suspected, though she was careful with hope, had learned to be, that Elias Westbrook, whether he knew it yet or not, Matt was already beginning to let her. Winter came to the mountain the way it always did, not as a single event, but as a slow, deliberate claim. First, the mornings grew harder, the frost arriving earlier each day and staying longer. Then the creek dropped in temperature until the stones along its edge grew white koalas of ice that crunched under boots in a way that was almost musical. Then one morning, Evelyn woke at the boarding house and looked out her window, and the ridge was gone, buried in the first real snowfall of the season, and Coldwater Bluff exhaled the quiet collective breath of a town that had been waiting for something to finally settle. She had been going up the mountain every day for 6 weeks. It had not been dramatic. That was the thing about it that was hardest to explain to Ida Phaneuf, who asked questions with her eyes even when her mouth was doing something else. There had been no single moment, no declaration, no evening where everything shifted and became something new. It had been incremental, a shared meal becoming a habit becoming something expected becoming something close to needed, though neither of them used that word or anything near it. She had fixed the window frame in the second bedroom. He had not asked her to. She had simply arrived one morning with the right tools, borrowed from the general store with Ida's knowing silence, and done it while he was out checking the south fence line. And when he came back and found it done, he had stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment without saying anything. Later, at the table, and he had said, "You didn't have to do that." "The cold was getting in," she said. He looked at his coffee. "Still, Elias." She said his name the way she said most things, plainly, without performance. "I'm not keeping score, I'm just here." He had looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not gratitude exactly, and not surprise exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Something that looked like a man recognizing a thing he had stopped believing existed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She understood him well enough by then to know that silence, with Elias Westbrook, was not emptiness. It was the place where the real things lived. The story that Coldwater Bluff told about Elias was not a simple one. Evelyn had gathered it in pieces, from George Lawson at the dinner table, from Ida in careful half-sentences, from Percy once, unexpectedly, on the trail when the boy had decided, apparently, that she had earned the truth. 7 years ago, Elias had owned a smaller property on the edge of town. He had a partner in a cattle operation, a man named Harding, well-liked, well-connected, the kind of man whose handshake meant something in a county where reputation was currency. There had been a dispute over land boundaries, then a fire. A barn on Harding's property burned to the ground in the early hours of a March morning. Harding had pointed at Elias. The town had believed him, because Harding was known, and Elias, even then, was quiet in ways that made people uneasy. The trial had lasted 4 days, but the verdict was not guilty. There was no evidence, only accusation. But verdicts in small towns are only partly about what happens in a courtroom. The rest happens on the street, in the store, at the church door, in the way eyes slide away when you walk in somewhere. Elias had stayed in town for 8 months after the trial. Then he had bought 40 acres on the ridge, built his house, and come down only when necessity required it. Harding had moved away 2 years later. The truth of the fire, that it had started from a lantern left burning by one of Harding's own hands, had come out eventually, the way these things do in small towns, quietly and too late. Some people had gone up to apologize. Elias had listened, thanked them, and closed the gate behind them when they left. He had not come back down. But when Percy finished telling her this, he had looked at her with the serious eyes of a 13-year-old who has decided to trust someone and wants to know if that was the right choice. "Does it change anything?" he asked. Evelyn had thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "No," she said. "It just explains some of the rooms." Percy had nodded, satisfied, and they had walked the rest of the trail without speaking. She told Elias she knew on a Tuesday evening in late November, when the snow was coming down steadily outside, and they were sitting by the stove with the particular ease of 2 people who have stopped being careful around each other without quite announcing it. "I know about the trial," she said, "and Harding, and the 8 months." He was still for a moment. Then he set his cup down. "Percy," he said, "don't be hard on him. He was protecting you in the only way he knew how, by making sure I understood you before I decided anything." Elias was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Snow pressed silently against the glass. "It shouldn't have taken 7 years, he said finally. Not bitterly, just as a fact. The way a man states a fact, he has made peace with even though the peace cost him something. "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't have." "I'm not angry anymore," he said. "I want you to know that. It's not anger that keeps me up here." "I know," she said. "It's habit, and habit is harder to leave than anger, because at least anger has heat in it." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes without flinching, the way she always did, the way that had unsettled him at first, and now felt like the most solid thing in his life. Evelyn," he said, and then stopped. "Say it," she said quietly. "I don't know how to be what someone needs," he said. "I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten the—" He paused, searching for the word. "The adjustments, the accommodations, what it means to build something with another person instead of just next to them." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way she always chose them, deliberately, without waste. "You made 2 cups of coffee the morning I arrived," she said. "Before you'd even met me. You already knew I was coming, and you made 2 cups. She paused. "You haven't forgotten as much as you think." The fire shifted in the stove. He looked at her for a long time, and then Elias Westbrook, who had not let anyone past his fence line in 3 years, yet who had built his solitude brick by careful brick out of necessity and pain and the slow calcification of a wound that had never been properly treated, reached across the small space between them and took her hand. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They were married in the spring, not in the church in Coldwater Bluff, though the offer was made and genuinely meant. They were married on the property on a clear morning in April, when the snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes and the first real green was showing through the brown of last year's grass. Sheriff Cobb performed the ceremony, which was his legal right, and which he did with a brevity and sincerity that suited both of them perfectly. Ida Finney came, and Percy, and George Lawson, who cried without embarrassment and denied it afterward. Elias wore a clean shirt and had cut his hair. He stood at the fence line, where Evelyn had first seen him, and watched her walk toward him across the open ground of his property, and felt something happen in his chest that he had no adequate word for. Something that was partly terror and partly the particular relief of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has finally stepped into warmth. Evelyn wore her good traveling dress and carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Percy had found somewhere on the trail and presented to her that morning with great ceremony and zero explanation. She walked toward Elias across the wet spring grass and thought about the notice she had read in the back of a St. Louis Gazette on a gray afternoon when her life had felt too small and too loud at the same time. That she thought about the 3-line notice that hadn't promised anything and hadn't needed to. She had been right about him. She had known she was right, somewhere below certainty, from the very beginning. But knowing a thing and living a thing are different, and she felt the difference now, felt it in the way he looked at her as she came toward him, steady and open and slightly undone, in a way he probably didn't know was visible. She reached him. He took both her hands. Cobb read the words. They said the ones required. The wind moved through the pines above them, and the mountain held its enormous quiet the way it always did. And for once it did not feel like isolation. It felt like witness. 2 years later, the house on the ridge had 4 rooms that were all fully used. What's the second bedroom, the one with the window Evelyn had fixed before anyone asked her to, had a small bed in it now, and a name. Their daughter was called June, born in the summer as her name suggested, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's unhurried way of taking in the world. She was a serious child who laughed easily and slept deeply, and had, at 18 months old, already developed a strong opinion about which stories she wanted. Read to her before bed. Elias came down the mountain now. Not often. Not for everything. But he came to market once a month, not because Percy couldn't manage it, but because Percy was 15 now and had other interests, and because Elias had decided, quietly and without announcement, that there were things worth being present for. He came to Ida's store, and he nodded to people on the street who nodded back with the particular warmth of a community that knows it did wrong and is grateful every time for the chance to do better. Evelyn watched this happen, the way she watched most things, without comment, without ceremony, just with the quiet, steady attention of a woman who understood that healing was not an event, but a direction, and that the only thing required of her was to keep showing up. On an evening in late October, 2 years and a season after she had first stepped off a stagecoach in a town she had never seen before, Evelyn sat on the porch of the house on the ridge, with June asleep against her shoulder, and the valley spread out below them in the long gold light of a dying afternoon. She could hear Elias inside, moving in that unhurried way of his, the stove door opening. That's the quiet sounds of a man at home in his own life. He came out a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her without speaking, the way he always did, and handed her 1 cup and looked out at the valley and the light. After a while, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his cheek against her hair. June slept on, unbothered, in the way of children who have never known anything but safety. The mountain was quiet around them, the same enormous, deliberate quiet It had always been, but it was theirs now, this silence, built into rather than buried in, shared instead of survived. And that, in the end, was everything.